From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A New York jury finds Donald Trump guilty of 34 bookkeeping felonies related to hush money paid to Stormy Daniels in advance of the 2016 election. But what are Donald Trump's chances on appeal, and how is this likely to affect the November election and his campaign against the incumbent president, Joe Biden? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Bill McGurn and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. After a 6-week trial and 2 days of deliberations, the jury was just about to be dismissed at 4:30 on Thursday when the news came that the 12 jurors had reached a unanimous verdict. It was shortly thereafter read out in the courtroom, guilty on 34 felonies for falsifying business records in 2017. Let's listen to a clip of Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg explaining his view of this verdict.
The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor.
Bill, what do you make of this verdict, the precedent that it will set now for the country, and the district attorney's argument there that it was made without fear or favor?
Yeah, I think people see that for the nonsense that it is. You know, in the run-up to this, there was a fevered race among prosecutors in the country, federal and state, to see who could get Donald Trump first. And Alvin Bragg seems to have won that. You can go over all the points of law and so forth. I don't blame the jury, but I think the fact is that Donald Trump was going to be found guilty, and the prosecutor and the judge did everything possible to make that happen, with a lot of questionable things regarding witnesses, decisions like that, even how the judge was chosen and so forth. So you can argue the law forever, but I think everyone sees it for what it was, an extraordinary effort to convict a former president who's also the Republican candidate for president.
As a reminder of the facts and the law here, the indictment that was filed initially by the district attorney accused Trump of falsifying business records. These could not be misdemeanor charges because the statute of limitations on that had already run. So they were elevated up to felony charges, meaning that the prosecution had to prove that President Trump cooked the books essentially with intent to conceal or cover up a second crime. And the way that this case ended up being structured to the jury, Kate, I think is somewhat fascinating and potential grounds for appeal, because the second crime the district attorney alleged was this New York statute that prohibits conspiracies to elect political candidates by unlawful means. But that means that inside of that second crime, the DA also needed a third crime. And he alleged that this was a repayment to Michael Cohen, that the repayment to Michael Cohen for this Stormy Daniels payoff was structured in a way that caused false information to be filed with tax authorities, or maybe it was a federal campaign finance violation, or maybe there were other business records that were also falsified, these wire transfer documents that Michael Cohen filled out, or these documents Michael Cohen filled out to create an LLC in order to make this transfer. But it's interesting, I think, because when you get down to it, those are not the nitty-gritty details that the prosecution wanted to talk about. What the prosecution wanted to talk about was that this was what maybe decided the 2016 election. And I'll read just a quote from the prosecutor who did the closing argument. He said, "This scheme cooked up by these men at this time could very well be what got President Trump elected. This was overt election fraud, an act in furtherance of the conspiracy to promote Mr. Trump's election by unlawful means. So, Kate, that is the story that they told the jurors in this case. But all of the rest of it is what's going to end up before an appeals court. And an appeals court may take a different view of this novel legal structure than the judge in this case in the Manhattan court did.
Right. I mean, I think we've described this legal structure in different ways as a turducken, as those Russian nesting dolls where there's one that comes out and it's smaller and it's smaller. And I think that's accurate. I think there are any number of things that could form an appeal. You describe accurately how what the prosecution did were to try to take these confusing set of particulars and put them all in one large stew and blur a lot of distinctions that are important. For instance, Stormy Daniels testified and spent a lot of her time talking about the salacious details with her alleged tryst with Donald Trump. That is not actually relevant to any of the underlying issues that you're describing. That could be one basis to form an appeal of why should her testimony be allowed to be so broad and go into all these details, when it's not a question of whether Trump is an unseemly person or whether he carried on with her. And even the payment itself to her, a non-disclosure payment, is not necessarily illegal. So I think there was a lot of, really, it's hard to call it anything but intentional mixing of what the real issues are to create this larger narrative. And when I heard the verdict, the first thing I thought of was back to something Mitch McConnell said about 10 years ago when the Democrats broke the filibuster to pack the D.C. court, which is, you'll regret this and you'll regret it a lot sooner than you think. And I think that is really the message Democrats should take from this, because I think it's going to inflame the country's politics in ways that are just impossible to predict now. The appeals are going to play out all throughout the election and then longer. Trump has a good chance at reversal. But even if Trump is ultimately vindicated, as I think he may be, the lasting damage to the perception of the justice system, I mean, it's a significant moment.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Bill, what do you make of the argument that is circulating in some quarters that the defense could have taken a different approach here and done a strategic and done a tactical retreat on a couple issues? Donald Trump has denied all along that anything ungentlemanly happened when he met Stormy Daniels. He has also denied through his defense that the payment that he made to Michael Cohen in 2017 was a reimbursement for the hush money that Michael Cohen paid to Stormy Daniels in 2016. The defense made the argument when they did their closing that there was a verbal retainer agreement between President Trump and Michael Cohen, even though Michael Cohen denied that on the stand. And I get that the defense lawyers have to deal with a difficult client who is Donald Trump, whose instinct is to deny always and attack always. But Bill, what do you make of the idea that if they had stipulated that there was some sort of affair, if they had stipulated maybe that Donald Trump did reimburse Michael Cohen, but then made the case to the jury that we've acknowledged those things, you can find us credible when we are making the case that this was at worst a bookkeeping misdemeanor that is past the statute of limitations. It wasn't the kind of felonies, the kind of conspiracy that the DA wants to sell here.
I think that's an interesting intellectual exercise. Probably a lot of lawyers are going over that now, but in the end, I don't think it would matter. I think this judge and this prosecutor led the jury to what they wanted, a conviction. I don't think it would have made any difference. The second thing is, I think, in fact, really, the law doesn't make any difference here, in the sense that it certainly makes a difference to Trump whether he's ultimately acquitted on appeal. But for the purposes of the case, his enemies win, even if it's reversed. In this way, it's a lot like the laptop that came up as a factor in the last election, and it was suppressed. And 51 former intelligence officials, pro-Biden, came out with a statement saying has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. We now know it isn't true. In fact, it's going to be used next week by the Biden Department of Justice in their prosecution of Hunter Biden. But it served its purpose, like the Steele dossier. We now know it's cooked up by the Hillary campaign, but it serves its purpose, and the purpose was political. So I don't think making too much of the legal ins and outs of the case, Matt, because I think it misses the main point. This was a gross political exercise. I think an abuse of power. Look, the New York Appeals Court recently overturned the conviction of Harvey Weinstein. So I think Trump stands a good shot.
Let's listen to a piece of President Biden's response to the verdict.
The American principle that no one is above the law was reaffirmed. Donald Trump was given every opportunity to defend himself. It was a state case, not a federal case, and it was heard by a jury of 12 citizens, 12 Americans, 12 people like you. Like millions of Americans who served on juries, this jury is chosen the same way every jury in America is chosen. It was a process that Donald Trump's attorney was part of. The jury heard 5 weeks of evidence, 5 weeks. And after careful deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. They found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts. Now he'll be given the opportunity, as he should, to appeal that decision just like everyone else has that opportunity. That's how the American system of justice works. And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
Kate, there was some grace notes there about acknowledging President Trump's right to appeal this verdict, but I'm scratching my head wondering why President Biden is talking at length about this at all. Because remember, the argument that we've already heard from President Trump, and I can only imagine we will hear more between now and the November election, is this was all a political setup to try to derail Donald Trump from winning the election. And to Bill's point about whether the appeal is successful, if President Trump loses the election and then is vindicated on appeal, boy, if Democrats think Republicans are talking too much about stolen elections right now, imagine that. And the more that President Biden leans into defending this prosecution, the more I worry that he's enabling those kinds of arguments.
Yes, his comments are not helpful as a tonic on the situation at all. And I mean, you can respect the jury for their service and the outcome while still noting this narrative that no one is above the law is absurd when you apply it to a misdemeanor with an expired statute of limitations that's trumped up to a felony and then has to be in service of a second crime that, by the way, the second crime itself doesn't have to be charged. I just don't think that anybody who looks closely at this case is going to think, well, you know, Donald Trump was treated the way all other defendants are. But that is a question for the prosecution and for the DA, not the jury. So I think you can respect the outcome without doing what Biden is doing there. I don't think it will calm the political passions around it at all, because he is perceived as being associated with this effort, because there are so many Democrats who have been trying to, like Bill said earlier in the podcast, be the first one to get Trump on charges before the election. That's been a pretty clear goal of several of these cases. I don't see that as helpful, and it would have been wiser for him to say nothing at all about it, but that he seems incapable of restraining himself.
Let's turn to the political effects. One fascinating detail in the first 24 hours is apparently the amount of money that has been pouring into Donald Trump's presidential campaign in response to this verdict. Let's listen to Donald Trump speaking briefly about that.
Last night, we just got a report this morning. In the history of politics, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody will find that I'm wrong, maybe, but I don't think so. They raised with small money donors, meaning like $21, $42, $53, $38, a record $39 million in about a 10-hour period. No, think of that.
There's some news reporting on this that also says that nearly a third of these donors to the Trump campaign are new donors through this donation website, Bill. So what do you make of the political effects? Will this buoy President Trump's base, and will it be enough to make up for any potential effect on swing voters?
Yeah, I think it'll lead his base to double down, to be outraged, I think properly so, about the treatment of their candidate. The question is, Donald Trump is strong with his base and maybe weaker with independents and swing voters. The opposite of President Biden, who's weak, I think, with both, but his base. So I was looking at polls before showing some people said a conviction on a felony count would change your vote for Trump. They wouldn't vote for him. I'm not so sure of that today. I have informal reaction. I'm not a pollster, but in the people I've talked to and met, many of them not Trump supporters, I find many are outraged by this and are more willing to entertain Trump as a candidate because they're really repulsed by the legal system and what it's done.